So hello and welcome everyone to our second day of the Iustoria 2001 conference. Our subject is law and religion. We already had a keynote lecture and 3 sessions dedicated to ancient and medieval law yesterday, and today we are starting the modern era, and our keynote lecture for today is Professor Decock from Leuven, and also at Liège in France, if I understood correctly. Yes, you have it written here. So Professor Decock will be talking about the law and morality of business in early modern Europe, as you can hopefully already see on your screens. Professor Decock, the floor is yours.
Hello, good morning. So can you hear me? Everything is going all right? Okay, thank you so much. So I'm really very glad to be here with you this morning and to help you in, let's say, moving from the ancient times and the medieval times to the early modern and then the modern period in your conference program, which looks really very exciting. I'm really very honored. I feel very, very honored by this invitation to speak to you, even if it's online. It's a fantastic opportunity, I think, to get to know and to meet each other. So special thanks to the organizing committee of the Iustoria conference, and especially to Nina Gulsian, who contacted me. To me, this is very special because, as you might know, just last week, we learned that Professor Michael Stolleis, who was a former director of the Max Planck Institute for Legal History, sadly left us. And he has been always someone who insisted a lot. I remember from my time in Frankfurt, he insisted a lot on opening up legal history to Southeastern Europe. And so to me, it's rather, even a little bit emotional to see that right at this moment now, I get this chance of getting to meet you and enter into this dialogue. This is a special word of homage to Professor Michael Stolleis, who last week left us, unfortunately. I would also like to mention, we have already talked about him before this conference, about Paolo Angelini, who was my close colleague at Leuven University, and who also really opened my eyes to this wonderful legal history of Southeastern Europe and the Serbian Empire in particular. He was, and he is still working on Stefan Dusan and 14th century Serbian legal history. It was part of a project that was initiated by Professor Laurent Walkens, who also unfortunately left us and died last year. But on the Jus Commune Greco-Romanum, he insisted a lot on the fact that we Western legal historians from Belgium, from Germany, from France, we should open our eyes to, let's say, the reception of Roman law and the Jus Commune in the southeastern parts of Europe. So that's just a small word of introduction to really also say thanks to you for reaching out to me. I think this is a great opportunity to get to know each other, and I hope that when COVID will be over, that we will have also the opportunity to meet live. Okay, so what will I do this morning? I will try to give a very brief talk on the law and morality of business in early modern Europe, because I think that's there's an example of the impact of religion on at least Western European legal history and also global legal history to a certain extent. It allows me, I think, to say some words about the DNA of European legal culture that is very much related to its religious origins. I will focus more particularly on the impact of the School of Salamanca, which was like Harvard Law School in the 16th century, so had a tremendous impact and influence. And in that School of Salamanca, we see law and religion really joining together, for example, to regulate the field of contract law and the market. So first, I will say a couple of general words about that DNA, so to speak, of European legal culture. Then explain to you what the School of Salamanca is, even though I know that there are experts here in our meeting room, like Alexis Odemar, who already know a lot about the School of Salamanca. And then their contribution to contract law and to certain aspects of commercial law. And then I will conclude with a final statement about Thomas de Mercado, for instance, who will also be the subject of Alexis' talk later today. So, understanding the DNA of European legal culture requires, I think, a return to its moral and religious roots. And I would really be looking forward to, during the discussion and also afterwards, to hear what you think about this, because as you will notice, my knowledge about Southeastern European legal history is extremely limited. And so my perspective is very much influenced by, let's say, a Western European legal historical perspective. So there are a lot of shortcomings there. But I would like to hear what you think about this thesis from your perspective after my talk. So, of course, the big name in law and in economics and in sociology and in legal history that is associated with this interest for the religious origins of our legal tradition is, of course, Max Weber. Max Weber, this picture you can see there to the right, Max Weber, who we should not forget was actually a legal historian by training. He wrote doctoral and habilitation on Roman law and then medieval commercial law. So he was a legal historian by training. And so he was interested in the way that religion influenced our mentality, our spirit, how this mentality influenced our way of life, and how that way of life finally had an impact on social action, on the way people behaved in their activities, in their jobs, and so on. And so this whole idea of sociology of religions that was moved forward by Max Weber is, I think, still something that can inspire us as legal historians if we want to understand the religious roots of the legal tradition in the West. Perhaps some of you have already had a chance to visit Max Weber's house in Heidelberg, where he would have private meetings with his students and create those study circles on sociology of religions. Of course, the work that we associate primarily with Max Weber is his Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. I think that's of course very well known among a lot of people. I think what we have to retain from it, amongst many other things, is that Max Weber already at the beginning of the 20th century actually had to warn his readers and his contemporaries that in our modern world we could have a tendency to kind of forget the real life impact that religion has had in our history. Already in the beginning of the 20th century, Weber noticed that most people were increasingly getting very far away, somehow alienated from religion. And so he recalled at some point, and I cite him, that modern man is generally incapable of fully realizing how considerable and massive the influence has been that the contents of religious conscience have exerted on the way of life, the culture, and the national character. Of course, there are a couple of references there, for instance, to the national character, and that have become also problematic, let's say, over the course of the 20th century after the World Wars. But in general, I think the intuition of Max Weber remains very interesting for us, that we have to look at religious sources to fully understand the development of our legal tradition. Over the last couple of years, the last 30 years, 40 years, let's say, there has been a renewed interest, let's say, in those religious roots. If you think of famous books like Law and Revolution, 2 volumes by Harold Berman, the Harvard law professor, who got intrigued in the religious roots of the Western legal tradition precisely through his confrontation as a diplomat with the communist system, and so the rather hostile policies against religion under the communist regime. So in Law and Revolution, of course, Harold Berman tries to fully appreciate the impact, especially of canon law, on different branches of the law. Also recently, I think 2 or 3 years ago, there's this economist from Harvard, Robert Barrow, who wrote again a book on the wealth of religions, in which he tries to establish those links between religious representations, convictions, and economic performance. So it's a topic that was first brought to the fore by Max Weber, but which still continues to attract interest among scholars. I think a fundamental methodological insight of Max Weber is that we need to read what is called the literature of the forum internum, of the literature of conscience and the cases of conscience, in order to understand the history of our economic and legal development. So I cite him again. In order to bring to light the connections that exist between religious ideas and maxims of the daily economic life, it is necessary to investigate primarily the theological writings that manifestly derive from the practice of caring for the souls, so in Latin, the cura animarum. As a matter of fact, at a moment in time when the afterlife was the most important thing, and the priests exerted an influence in practice that is beyond the imagination of us modern people, the religious forces at work in the practice of pastoral care have shaped the national character in a decisive way. So the forum internum, the cases of conscience literature, is something that we usually do not hear of in our legal history courses when we are trained as lawyers. But when we are interested in finding the roots of our legal system, I think that we need to follow Max Weber's advice and also get an interest in those theological sources. That was also the intuition of Michael Stolleis, the regretted Michael Stolleis, who wrote a lot of books on the impact of especially the Protestant religion, also on public law. One of his latest books was on the eye of the law, in which the law sees us all the time, but which is basically going back to a religious metaphor and the idea that God is watching you permanently. And so he also tried to analyze the consequences of this metaphor, of this understanding of the world and of God seeing you all the time for the regulation of life. Now, as you know, Max Weber, when studying this literature of cases of conscience, the pastoral care, focused specifically on Protestant sources and even in a more limited way, certain Protestant sources, namely the Puritan sources, like Richard Baxter, for instance, in the 17th century, William Ames. So I think Max Weber's intuition is very insightful, very important, but in his own work, he only, let's say, exploited and used part of his insights, because he limited himself to analyzing just part of the religious literature by looking at only part of the Protestant tradition, especially the Puritan religion and the way it had shaped the minds of the people to create a way of imagining life and also the active work life that is finally compatible with a capitalistic economic systems. I won't go into the details here, but of course I think it's important to recall that Max Weber was not looking at capitalism as just a kind of greedy attitude and just desire to make as much money as possible. He said, look, that's not what I'm looking for. This is a psychological drive that has been behind the behavior of millions of people since antiquity, that auris sacra fames, as he called it, the sacred hunger for gold. He said, that's not what I mean by capitalism. What I mean by capitalism is the accumulation of capital for the sake of accumulating it and without enjoying it. So a real capitalistic spirit or spirit that gives rise to the capitalistic society is actually a spirit of people who work for the sake of working without enjoying it, without buying posh cars with it, without buying posh properties with it. No, they just work for the sake of working, and they accumulate capital for the sake of accumulating capital. And why do they do that? Because they think it's their duty, it's their religious duty, because they are carrying out their worship towards God. And so, in fact, he says the real spirit that could give rise to this capitalistic economy is not an attitude of greed. No, it's an attitude of asceticism and rationalism, of discipline, of self-constraint. And he especially thought that the Puritans were champions in that kind of attitude. But at the same time, in his work, The Protestant Ethic, he acknowledged that his work was based on a limited amount of sources, and he did not exclude at all that other forms of Christian religion in particular could also give rise to the kind of mentality that is compatible with this capitalistic economy. So to a certain extent, the Max Weber thesis is incomplete. There is also, of course, as always happens with great authors, they tend to be interpreted in many different ways. And so I think one of the popular versions of the Max Weber thesis that circulates is that, yeah, capitalism is capitalism, but that is, of course, a very unnuanced statement in many regards. And especially, for instance, is also not taking sufficiently into account the fact that also on the Catholic side, for instance, you had similar movements that were equally, say, conducive to the capitalistic economy. And Max Weber, in a letter to one of his critics, actually explicitly recognized that what was later to become known as the Max Weber thesis was not what he intended to say. I'm citing him here. I expressly renounce, he said, the possibility of the absurd thesis according to which only the Protestant Reformation would have created the capitalistic spirit, let alone capitalism as an economic system. Important forms of capitalistic economic systems can be found long before the Reformation. And then in other passages of his work, he refers to the Jesuits in particular for having stimulated a mindset that is compatible with a capitalistic economy. Now, when talking of the Jesuits, there is one example in particular from the Low Countries, Leonardus Lessius, whose work is really testimony to the fact that also in the Catholic pastoral care, well, a lot of things happened that finally helped to justify the capitalistic spirit. Leonardus Lessius was born in Antwerp. So Antwerp, as you know, in the 16th century was really the scene of economic and financial developments that were very important for the whole economy on a global scale, since at that time Antwerp and the southern Netherlands were part of the Spanish Empire. And Leonardus Lessius was one of the spiritual counselors and pastors that took care of the salvation of the souls of all the merchants and bankers working on the Antwerp exchange. And I think in his work, I won't go into the details, but you can really see, for instance, the justification of the meritocratic spirit that is rather, I mean, mind-blowing and sometimes very surprising, very liberal to our modern minds. He, for instance, would emphasize a lot, the fact that, working hard is also, like for the Protestants, like working hard is just trying to honor your divine call. And so I cite here just one passage from his treatise on justice and right, Iustoria. The Lord, he says, does not want us to get all things necessary for life automatically, for free, without effort and without solicitude. If that were the case, the Lord would have given us the opportunity to indulge in a life free from concerns. That would be the origin of the greatest of all evils and the cushion of the devil. Of course, a very old idea, which reaches back to the monastic tradition, desert fathers, and so on. Rather, he says, the Lord wants man to be dedicated to work and business, so that busy in this exercise, occupatus exercitio, he remains far away from the pleasures and other sins that are the fruit of laziness. So this idea of occupatio, of being busy as a way of making sure that you also do not indulge into vicious behavior was, of course, very strong in the whole medieval Christian tradition already. But it reaches its apex in works of Jesuit moral theologians like Lessius in the second half of the 16th and the first half of the 17th century. Leonardus Lessius was himself from the Netherlands, which was part at the time of the Spanish Empire, and he was very much influenced by the school of Salamanca. The school of Salamanca, which had a tremendous impact, as I already mentioned, and compare it with, let's say, Harvard Law School today. where all the brightest minds would go and study law and theology, arts. And that school of Salamanca had a tremendous impact and radiation. So in the European continent, but also abroad. So many of the leaders in the colonies of Spain, in what is now South America, or also parts of Southeast Asia, many of these leading people, priests, but also jurists, would have gotten their training in Salamanca at the University of Salamanca, where I think in the early modern period we can really witness that kind of supreme synthesis of law and religious informed morality. So the medical founder, of course, you know him, is Francisco de Vitoria, often mentioned in the context of courses on international law, since he's considered one of the precursors of modern international law, also kind of someone who gave already an impetus to the notion of human rights. Francisco de Vitoria was a theologian by training. He had been trained in Paris, was a theologian by training, but explained at some point why he had the right to deal with legal and economic issues. And that was just a consequence, he said, of the fact that the office and the calling of a theologian are extremely wide, and so that no argument or controversy or any subject can be considered foreign to his profession. And that is in general the attitude of all these theologians that we encounter in Salamanca in the early modern period. They are not just theologians in the 21st century of the word. They were they were actually thinking like lawyers, we would say nowadays. The University of Salamanca, I hope some of you, or at least your students, have the possibility to engage in Erasmus exchange programs. Salamanca, like many other Spanish cities, is one of the favorite destinations of our students. Here in Belgium, at least, perhaps it's also the case in Serbia. But in any case, Salamanca is really the place to be. It's a fantastic city. The University of Salamanca is still standing there, so you can witness these buildings where people like Vitoria have been teaching. There is also the famous monastery of San Esteban, where Dominican theologians, so the order to which Vitoria and Las Casas belonged, is also in Salamanca, the Convento San Esteban, also a beautiful building from an architectural point of view. So we get a movement here in 16th, 17th century Salamanca that is really a synthesis of law and theology. Difficult to imagine at the beginning of the 21st century, but a huge reality back then. So here you have a couple of the big names, let's say, of these so-called theologians, jurists, the teólogos juristas in Spanish. Just in terms of context, I think it's important to remind that Salamanca is not the only case of this intense relationship between law and theology in the early modern period. Salamanca and the theologians of Salamanca themselves, they draw on a much older tradition, late medieval tradition, that is, for example, also instantiated by Pier Giovanni d'Olivi, who was a theologian and who took care of the souls of the merchants in the Mediterranean in the 13th century, and already published a treatise on sale contracts. He has been the subject of very interesting studies by Sylvain Piron, a scholar from the UHSS in Paris. You also have, in let's say Northeastern Europe, Matthew of Krakow, who wrote already a treatise on contracts as a theologian in the 14th century. We have at the University of Tübingen around 1500 publication on contracts by Konrad Zumenhard. And so this tradition then goes on through Salamanca and is being radiated everywhere. For instance, at my university, the University of Louvain, in the second half of the 16th century, where we can really see, and we have student notes, for instance, of the time, law students and theology students, and in their student notes, they refer to people of the School of Salamanca, like Domingo de Soto, or Dr. Navarus, Martin de Azpilicueta, and so on. So I can really see, we have really proof of the immense impact of that Salamanca school everywhere in Europe and beyond. Because, of course, as you know, the early modern period is the period of colonial expansion, and so following this colonial expansion, also the intellectual world of Salamanca moves and travels to other countries. Again, I cannot go into the details, but that's of course an important contextual matter. All these challenges, of course, for the early modern Spanish Empire, which will urge those theologians and jurists to reflect on a number of new legal issues in the field of public law, international law, human rights law, also the relationship between state and church, and so on. But then also on contract law and economic law. And so that's what I would like to go into now for the time that is remaining. Someone who has already in the 90s drawn a lot of attention to the importance of the School of Salamanca for the development of several fields of private law is James Gordley, of course. He must be mentioned in this framework. He is pioneering legal historians and comparative lawyer in this regard, who said that the real innovative power of the School of Salamanca consisted in the fact that they combined the kind of casuistic approach of Roman law, of canon law, and of moral theology with a more systematic approach that was based on, let's say, virtue ethics derived from Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, and which was then further impacted the legal tradition also outside of the Catholic countries of Europe through the natural law tradition, also the Protestant natural law tradition. People like Grotius, like Gautier in France, Pufendorf in the German, Scandinavian area, and so on. Here again, I cannot go into details, but I think it's interesting also to draw your attention to the fact that the size of impact of these Theologos Juristas on the legal tradition is now the subject of several studies at the Max Planck Institute for Legal History and Legal Theory in Frankfurt. So that, by the way, so Milena is the new building of the Max Planck Institute, where there is a whole team working on what is called multi-normativity. Multi-normativity is this idea that in the past, and especially in the early modern period, we cannot understand legal developments by just looking at, let's say, state law or by using a positivistic concept of law and normativity. We also need to take into account other forms of normativity, like, for instance, those cases of conscience literature that was also already the subject of Max Weber's studies. So, given the expansion of commerce and trade and new financial techniques to make that global commercial trade possible, one of the main points of discussion in the theological juridical literature of Salamanca is the regulation of the market. The regulation of the market, they did not have a concept, of course, like we have today of, let's say, economic law, but they dealt with a lot of issues that are now part of economic law or commercial law, through the framework of contract law, which was the, let's say, the juridical, which provided the juridical language for them to deal with all sorts of problems happening in the marketplace. I will give you here again just one example of the importance of that contractual framework, of that juridical analysis of the market, by mentioning Pedro de Oñate. Pedro de Oñate is a moral theologian who is really not well known at all. He figures in some legal history textbooks by Italian colleagues that I know, but in general, he's one of those many very interesting figures from history that has disappeared from our radar. But Pedro de Oñate was a Jesuit moral theologian who went to what is nowadays Argentina, and founded, for instance, the University of Cordoba, which still exists. So he was a very dynamic man. He also started businesses there, to make sure that Jesuits would have enough money to grant scholarships to students so that they would be able to attend the university. And Pedro de Oñate wrote a 4-volume treatise on contracts. It's really massive. It's thousands of pages on contract law. So published, let's say, a little bit earlier than the mid-17th century. And it's like a synthesis, a huge synthesis of all these theological engagements with contract law since the late medieval period. Pedro de Oñate says, look, a theologian, someone who takes care of the souls, has to understand contract law, because contract law is basically the framework through which you can understand all the specific duties and obligations and rights that people have in their daily life when they interact with each other, when they buy things, when they sell things, when they rent land, when they enter into a partnership contract, and so on. And so he says moral theologians should have a particular interest in contract law and try to make sure that in those daily exchanges, people do not only respect the law, and especially the jus commune rules and so on, but also Christian principles like the virtue of charity, of equity, and so on. And he warned at the introduction of his work that contract law is extremely vast and extremely difficult, but also extremely useful. I will come back on Onyate a little bit further on, but first let me say that he is like the endpoint also of a systematic treatment of contract law in the early modern scholastic tradition. So the scholastic tradition is an alternative way of referring to that moral theological tradition. So there was a huge systematization of private law that happened without necessarily ending the casuistic tradition. But those cases are now being put and discussed in the framework of a systematic account of private law. And just to give you an example of that systematic approach, I give you first on the left side here of that slide an overview of the volumes of treatise on justice and right, the Iustoria, Louis, important moral theologian belonging to the Jesuit order in the 16th century. And so in 1600, around 1600, actually between 1597 and 1608, he published this massive treatise on justice and right. There you can see that the first volume deals more with, let's say, property law issues, the law of succession, family law. Then there is a whole second volume dedicated to contract law. And he goes on to discuss tax law and torts law. And also at the end, eventually also he talks about civil procedure. So this also gives you an idea of how juridical these treatises were by theologians like Molina. On the right side, then I give you an example of what such a volume on contracts looks like. So if you zoom in on parts, volumes on contract law in this moral theological tradition, then you find a rather systematic treatment of first contract law in general, and then specific contracts. On the right, you can see the example of the table of contents of Leonardus Lessius' discussion of contract law in history, this on justice and right, that goes back to 1605. There are also some particularities. Of course, we would not think of legacies and wills and testaments as being part of contract law, but for them it was, in the sense that they defined contract as, and that's a very important innovation also, they defined contract as the meeting of an offer and an acceptance. And so they also thought that, like a testament is also like the offer by the person who has deceased, but it's his will. It has to be accepted by his successors. So in that sense, somehow testaments could be also framed as part of contract law, because you also have this offer and this acceptance, which is the basic definition of a contract in the eyes of the early modern theologians. So we get a very systematic treatment of contract law. At the same time, they discuss several cases, specific cases within this general theoretical framework. And the importance of these early modern theologians dealing with contract law is that they have promoted, really, that's also perhaps surprising, they have really promoted at least a certain concept of liberty of contract, of freedom of contract. And they also explain why. And this is very interesting. I mean, when we study law, I think very often we just have to learn by heart rules without really understanding why those rules have come into being. But here, when we look at these historical texts, for instance, by Pedro de Onyate, we see that they still explain why they adopt certain basic principles. And when it comes to this principle of freedom of contract, we see that Pedro de Onyate is well aware of the fact that This is actually something that the moral theologians have strived for over centuries, to try to make sure that there is more liberty of contract. And then he also explains why. So let me start by citing him. So he says at some point, reflecting on the contribution of the tradition that he stands in to contract law, he says, well, consequently, natural law, canon law, and Hispanic law entirely agree, and innumerable difficulties, frauds, litigations, and disputes have been removed thanks to such great consensus and clarity in the laws. To the contracting parties, he says, liberty has very wisely been restored, Latin, contra gentibus libertas restituta, so that whenever they want to bind themselves through concluding a contract about their goods, this contract will be recognized by whichever of both courts, the ecclesiastical or the civil court, before which they will have brought their case, and it will be upheld as being sacrosanct and inviolable. Therefore, Poniati concludes, canon law and Hispanic law correct the jus commune, so they correct the basic rules of Roman law, which did not yet have the principle of freedom of contract. Since the former grant an action and civil obligation to all naked agreements, all the pacta nuda, while the latter denied them just that. So you see a consciousness of the contribution of the Theologos Juristas to the general principles of contract law. And then on the next slide, you can see that he also motivates this, that this is not just for the sake of introducing freedom of contract. He also says, look, there is an anthropological foundation for this. It's precisely because we believe in God, who is like our creator, that we think that freedom of contract is important. So I cite him again. He says at some point, God left man the freedom to take care of himself, as is expressed in Ecclesiastes. One of the reasons being, no doubt, that he, God, left it to man's will to bind himself when he wanted. Now, actions do not operate beyond the will and the intention of the agents, but in accordance with their will and intention. Then goes on to discuss the way we have to interpret contracts. That's another matter. But here in the Latin, you can see this reference to the verb velle, and to the noun voluntas, the will. This is something surprising, but in his work, you constantly, these words of voluntas and the verb velle constantly return. So everything is about the will of the person as an emanation of the freedom of that person. And he says we need to give this freedom to the individuals, because otherwise man would not be the true and perfect honor, the dominus of his goods. That is, unless he could dispose of them when he wants, to whom he wants, and in whatever way he wants, by creating a contractual obligation. So there is a little, of course, also of property, and then contract as a tool of making sure that people can really deal with their property as they like. Very often, we think that in this moral theological tradition, theologians would insist on the bindingness of contracts because this is like a moral duty, because otherwise you are sinning, because you're not speaking the truth or something. And of course, those arguments are being used. But the interesting issue for us legal historians is that in the second half of the 16th and the beginning of the 17th century, you see that the main reason that is being given for the principle of freedom of contract and the bindingness of naked agreements is no longer that moral reasoning, but typically legal reasoning. Lessius, for instance, really analyzes contracts in terms of the exchange of obligations and rights. Promising, he says, does not merely come down to a factual affirmation of what the promiser is going to do or give in the future. Promising is about the creation of obligation, hence the conveyance of a right to the promisee, so that the promisee can enforce the promise. So we get this legal analysis in the theological sources, which will later almost word for word be borrowed by Hugo Grotius, for instance. Hugo Grotius, who was of course also from the Low Countries and who knew Lessius' work very well. What we also see in this contract law of the moral theologians is already an attempt to construct a transconfessional contract law. Of course, here the context matters again, especially in the Low Countries. From 1568 onwards, we have these wars against Spain, which increasingly get also a religious nature. We have these tensions between the Catholics and the Protestants, then also the different factions of the Protestants, the Calvinists, the Lutherans, the Anglicans, and in a place like Antwerp, which historically speaking is a meeting place of, for instance, the English merchant adventurers, which are now Anglicans, and then Lutheran people from Frankfurt, for instance, Catholics from Southern Europe. This was not just a theoretical problem. The problem was really, I mean, can you, as a Protestant creditor, can you claim in court debts owed to you by a Catholic merchant? Because the whole idea was that fides, faith in contracts, is very much related to the religious faith that you adhere to. And in the canon law, for instance, in the Roman law already, we find ideas according to which heretics do lose their rights, can no longer take other people to court, or even being expropriated, and so on. And so these early modern theologians, influenced by the school of Salamanca, tried to create a natural law framework for contract law, precisely to escape, to go beyond those political tensions and these practical problems arising out of the splitting up of medieval Christianity and this context of religious wars. So you get treatises with names like De Fide Haeretici Servanda, so on the need to respect your faith, as your given word, also to heretics. Of course, keeping promises to Muslims remained an altogether different issue that remained very problematical. But within Christianity, at least, they sought to establish a kind of a neutral private law that could make sure that people's rights and obligations were not negatively affected by these differences in Christian religion. Of course, this is not, so the freedom of the will that is being promoted by Oñate and his other colleagues from the School of Salamanca is, of course, not the freedom of the will as we know it from 19th century American versions, or then also European positivist versions, in the sense that in scholastic contract law, notions such as good faith, as fairness, as equity and charity remain also very important. It has consequences, of course. It has consequences, for instance, the fact that there is this notion of the just price, which has disappeared from most contemporary legal systems. Now, on the other hand, notions like the just price are not as obsolete as one might think, because when you look at the definitions given of concepts like the just price in the work of those moral theologians, you are actually surprised of how modern that sounds and how much importance they give actually to the functioning of the market. So just price is in many regards actually a price established in the market, in a normally functioning market. Let's just at some points describes the factors that determine the establishment of a price. He says some of these circumstances relate to the commodities themselves, their scarcity or abundance, the common need for them, and their subjective utility. There are circumstances pertaining to the seller, his labor, his expenses, the risks and damages he incurs. Furthermore, there is the mode of selling, namely whether the commodities are offered spontaneously or sold on demand. And the final factor concerns the buyers, whether they are few or many, and whether there is lack or abundance of money. So you can see here why historians of economic thought have also been interested in the works of these people of the School of Salamanca, because somehow within their normative analysis, they also try to analyze what is really happening on the ground in the economy. And so the just price theory is not somehow referring to a kind of metaphysical universe where every good has already its price or something. No, it's very much empirically established. Of course, the scholastics accept that sometimes the government can come in and regulate markets for the sake of protecting weaker persons, especially poor consumers. And these are all the debates which I can not go into, of course, also about the regulation of the grain and the bread prices and so on. But these are notions, of course, like the common good, bonum commune, which are absent from 19th century liberal versions of contract law doctrine and contractual freedom, which are, of course, very important to the early modern theologians. This notion of fair bargaining fair bargaining or cumulative justice, to use the term of the early modern theologians themselves. It means, of course, that they really try to make sure that a contract is useful for all the parties involved. They do not like zero-sum games, and they also accept that sometimes the laws have to rein in the liberty of the persons, because man is somehow, even though they are Catholics and not Protestants, they also believe, of course, that somehow man is corrupt after the fall of Adam and Eve and the first man. So it's also necessary sometimes to bind our will. Mercado, who will, so the subject, I think, of Alexis, his talk, said. At the same time, again, we see these very modern ideas like the concept of contractual security. In medieval canon law, there was still the idea that there was always a kind of implicit intention in contracts, and this idea of changed circumstances, which could lead to the unbindingness of a contract. But this is increasingly abandoned by early modern theologians. I give the example here of Juan de Lugo, very important Italian, became an Italian cardinal then, in which he really cites this notion of the security of contracts, the securitas contractus. Then, so he does no longer accept this medieval canon law idea of the tacit condition, this doctrine of changed circumstances, because he says otherwise commercial relationships will always be in danger if there is always this risk that one of the parties says that the circumstances have changed fundamentally. So people really have to be able to rely on the promises they made, on the agreements they made. So he introduces really this concept of security of contracts. That is now part of our larger notion, I would say, of legal security. This gives rise to very interesting debates about debt relief, what to do with someone who, for instance, now in the COVID crisis, can no longer pay his rent because his shop is closed and so on. What to do in this kind of situations. As you know, in the Christian tradition, we have the Lord's Prayer, which asks us to forgive our debtors like they forgive us. And there is a whole long exegetical tradition on the question whether this can be applied to commercial relationship or whether this is purely spiritual, this message in the Lord's Prayer. The early modern scholastics were clearly of the opinion that the Lord's Prayer did not apply to commercial relationships anymore, and that cancellation of debt should really be looked upon with a lot of skepticism. They warned for people who falsely pretended to be poor and insolvent. They considered that debt cancellation was like a donation, was like making a gift, and gifts should never be presumed in the market, they said. And so when they try to mitigate the effects of kind of these circumstances and prevent debtors from falling into the abyss of despair, as they call it, they called upon the charitable character of the creditor and asked the creditor in extreme circumstances to delay the enforcement of the contract. So the so-called dilatio debiti, the extension of payment, was considered the preferred way to deal with situation whereby debtors had problems to pay back their debt. So this is a very interesting exercise, of course, because here different principles to which these scholars adhered. So on the one hand, security of contract, liberty of contract. On the other hand, notions of charity, of equity of natural law, the Lord's Prayer, and so on, the idea of the Jubilee in the Bible, and so on, clashed, and they had to find compromise between all these different principles. So as said before, this notion of the just price very much reflects actually the establishment of a price on a competitive market. So this is something that is also typical of these early modern theologians when it comes to their economic thought and the regulation of the market. They were very much against dominant positions and market abuse, because they said in those kind of situations, just price is no longer just, because we have people manipulating the prices. So this is bad. On the other hand, there were also difficult discussions, intricate discussions on what one should do in the face of merchants who had been actually very hardworking, and through their hard work and through just contracts had actually managed to get a dominant position through their own industry, Iustoria, very important notion. So what to do with those kinds of merchants? Someone like Lessius was actually saying it's very difficult to condemn those kind of dominant positions, very difficult to condemn Amazon, very difficult to condemn Google and so on, because these people have put a lot of investment and effort in creating their dominant position. So he said, well, from the point of view, let's say, of pure contract law, from the point of view of pure private law, you can actually have nothing against these people because they have acquired their property in honest ways. At least if we can assume that they have gained their position through legitimate contracts. Yeah, then once they are honored, they are honored. And since they adhere to this very liberal concept of property and contract, they can have nothing against it. But the only way that Lessius and other early modern scholastics are able to condemn this kind of practices is by saying, look, there is the community, of course, which also can establish criminal laws and which can punish certain forms of behavior that are contrary to the public interest, to the common good. And so if we want to condemn those practices, if we want to call these people to account, we cannot do it through contract law, but we have to do it through public law, through criminal law. So that's also very interesting articulation that starts here between, let's say, the different levels of private law, of public law. It's somehow a kind of a prefiguration of the existence of a specific economic law, which is at the intersection of public law and private law, I think. But on the other hand, you can really see that these early modern theologians, given that they were so much in favor of hard work and of rewarding very prudent merchants and bankers and so on, they were constantly also seeking to reward, also from a moral and justify from a moral point of view, all kinds of profit-seeking behavior based on Iustoria, based on this very positive attitude towards working hard and being insightful into the markets. And in that regard, very interestingly, we can see in the 17th century, in the scholastic tradition, really this notion emerging also of intellectual property and the need to protect intellectual property. Here at some point, Juan de Lugo says in his treatise on justice and right, in order to support and encourage the intelligence and the industry of authors and printers, they deserve a monopoly for a period of 10 years. So the idea of legal monopolies, which then also end up in the idea of, let's say, intellectual property rights. By the same token, it's only just that government should grant the same privileges to inventors of machines and inventors of technology useful to the Republic as a reward for their inventions, which are the fruits of their industry, the fructus industriae. It would be inappropriate if competitors took the same advantage of the vigilance deployed by the inventors and at their expense. Whom I already mentioned, even also uses the terminology of private law, of property law. He says they are exercising their own right by refusing to share their personal expertise for free, since this knowledge can be considered as their private property. So you can really see how this theological tradition responded to the challenges of the day. This is not just an abstract discourse. They are really in touch with what is happening in the market, and they are reframing contract law, commercial law, to make sure that it can respond to this reality and that they can create like a normative framework that stimulates commercial behavior, that stimulates industry and commercial prudence. So to conclude, I think it's very, very important, and these authors show us that it's very important to keep in mind the duality of the European legal tradition. So once again, so I'm very much speaking here from a Western European perspective, so it will be very important to have your take on this as well from Southern European, Southeastern European point of view. But I think at least for what happened, say, in like my region, the Low Countries and so on, you cannot understand legal historical developments without taking into account the fundamental duality of the European legal tradition. So this dualism between body and soul, which reaches back, of course, to the periods before Christianity, with Plato and Greek philosophy and so on. This fundamental dualism in the organization of society and law between, let's say, state authorities and church authorities, distinction between law and morality, which leads to this normative pluralism, which fundamentally characterized early modern law. You can also see at some points in the very close collaboration between those powers. There is not always a tension, but also a real collaboration between those two levels. And that's especially the case, I would say, in the treatise on contracts, the treatise on trade and contract, Tratos y Contratos de Mercaderes, by Tomas Mercado, the 16th century Dominican friar, whom Alexis will tell you more about. He very often emphasizes, to defend the Catholic religion also in the face of the Protestant threat. He emphasizes towards the authorities that they have actually a good partner in those theologians and in the priests, because he says sometimes the courts cannot enforce certain claims, contractual claims, or they cannot prosecute certain criminal behavior, whereas we, the priests, we can actually. So we can help the governors to make sure that the society is well ordered and that the rules are being respected. He says we help to interiorize finally government policies. And so in Spanish, he at some point says that these moral theologians, that these priests are muy padres de la República, are much like the fathers of the Republic. So there is also this issue really of collaboration between the religious and the secular authorities. And I think if one looks at the work of someone like Mercado, but even more so when you study the works of these Jesuit moral theologians, you can really see how they helped justify from a normative point of view the rise of a truly commercial and capitalistic society in the early modern period. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm really looking forward to your criticism, your questions, and your take on my story, which is of course very limited and based on Western European perspective. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Decock. This was a very, very interesting lecture. And I see we already have a raised hand. Mattia has a question. Mattia, go ahead.
Okay, thank you for giving me the floor. I will thank Professor Wim for his presentation. I actually have a question which is quite general, because Professor Wim, he said himself that he wants to, here in Eastern European, I might add an orthodox takes on the question, and I'm interested in this following position, that in contemporary Orthodox literature, it's always a remark which is made not to the legal tradition, but actually to the religious tradition of Western Europe, saying that it is too juridic, that it is too causistic. And they say that it's actually because the jurisprudence is older than Christian theology, and that Western Holy Fathers, when they did theology, they actually subscribed to the legalistic manner of thinking, and they always say it was Augustine who first did it. And so I actually wanted him to share me some light. What is his take on it? Maybe if there truly was some penetration of legalistic thinking into theology, when is his take on it? When did it happen? And maybe give me, as somebody who is not knowledgeable, some insights. What should I maybe read, or maybe are those criticisms in his opinions grounded or not? So that's what I wanted to share.
Okay, Nina, shall I answer immediately, yes, or do you first collect other questions? Or?
No, go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, Mattia, for your comments and question. I didn't hear everything you said, I must say. Somehow it was very silent. but I think you are inquiring about like this legalistic nature of theology in let's say the Western tradition. Is that right? Did I hear that correctly?
Yes, that's correct.
And then what was the, because in the beginning you also talked about the Orthodox tradition. Could you repeat what you said exactly? Because I couldn't understand it.
I didn't know that you didn't hear me well.
Matthew, could you maybe try talking a little closer to the microphone? Your sound is very quiet.
Okay, do you hear me better now? Is it better now?
Yes, much better.
Okay, it's because of the headphones. Well, what was my question was that in contemporary Orthodox literature, foremost theological literature, there is this constant objection and criticism of Western theology, that it is too causistic and legalistic in its thinking. They're saying that they got from the Roman jurisprudence, that they inherited their method of solving things, that it is not intrinsic to Christian thought, and they think they got a lot of their problems from the fact that they use the legal method to solve Christian and theological problems. And they are saying it's because, you know, it was a ground where there was a jurisprudence which was much older and so and so. And I wanted just your thought on it. Did this really penetration, did it happen? When did it take place? And do you think that those early Christian fathers, they are always saying it was Augustine, Saint Augustine, who is to blame for that? And because they're saying, you know, that he didn't know Greek, he could not read Greek Holy Fathers, but he knew a lot of Latin, so he read a lot of Cicero. And that they're saying he modeled his thought in a legalistic manner, and not merely in this apophyctical theological manner of speaking and thinking. That's what I wanted to ask. What is your thought on it? Did this penetration happen? Are there some sources which I could use to broaden my knowledge on this subject? And it's basically that what I wanted to ask you. Thank you.
Thank you. That's really fascinating what you're telling. Very, very interesting. So I was not aware of the fact that in the Orthodox theological tradition, this reproach, so to speak, is being made towards, let's say, Western forms of Christianity, that they have been too much open, let's say, to legal ways of thinking. It's very interesting because, of course, it reminds me of the criticism that, of course, the Protestants in the 16th century, especially Luther himself, launched against the canon law tradition. His criticism was exactly the same. He would say, like, yes, Western Christian theology has become too legalistic. So we need to go back to the gospel, or we need to go back also to the Greek church fathers. So this is a critique that is then apparently shared between, let's say, Orthodox theological literature today and, for instance, someone like Luther. But it's also shared, I think, with more recent 20th century ways of looking within the Catholic tradition, for instance, towards the history of the Catholic tradition. You have had this whole movement starting in the early 20th century, for instance, by people like Henri de Lubac, very influential Catholic theologian, who was himself a Jesuit, but who reproached exactly those things to the historical tradition of moral theology and canon law, also in the Catholic tradition. He said, look, they have too much based themselves on Roman law and on Aristotle. That was exactly his criticism. And then in the 20th century, let's say, Catholic theology, you have this move towards a more evangelical understanding of morality, and a kind of, I would even say that today, this whole tradition of the early modern scholastics and canon law has almost fallen into oblivion, I think, for the general consciousness within the Catholic Church. But there is actually a very interesting article by a professor from Harvard, by Charlie Donahue, on like the different phases within, let's say, the Western more Catholic legal tradition on either welcoming law or rejecting law as a basis for thinking the church and its normative structure. The exact title of the contribution now is escaping me, but it's a contribution by Charlie Donahue in The Jurist. The Jurist is a journal published by Washington University, the University of Washington. Let me try if I can find it. So Charles Donoghue is of course a very important legal historian from Harvard. And so in the jurists, yeah, I have it. The chats here in.
Yes, there's a chat in the lower right corner.
Yeah, and I will try to share it. Yeah, indeed. To everyone. Yep. So Charles Donoghue. So the title of the article is "A Crisis of Law: Reflections on the Church and the Law over the Centuries," and this is exactly the topic of this article that you mentioned. You know, like when was the Church in the West, at least, open towards law, especially the Roman law tradition, and when were there moments when it tried to abandon that? Of course, indeed, as you mentioned, Augustine may have played an important role in it, to the extent that he was, of course, also leading an episcopal audiencia, which were the tribunals within the Roman Empire, led by the Catholic Church, and which had full, which were recognized by the Roman Emperor. But I think the real move towards integration of law and theology comes with the Gregorian Revolution, and then of course with the canon law in the 12th century. And then the idea that you cannot be a good church lawyer or even a moral theologian without sound knowledge of Roman law. And then you have this whole idea. In Latin they expressed it as follows: Ecclesia vivit lege Romana, which is typical for the 12th century church. So the church lives by virtue of the Roman law. So this intense symbiosis, I think, emerges really in the 12th century with the canon law, and is then being made even more forcefully in the face of the Protestant threat by the school of Salamanca. It kind of reinforced the typical canon law tradition in the face of the criticism launched at this tradition, at this legalistic thinking launched by Martin Luther. But many more things could be said about this. It's not, of course, I mean, just like I guess in Orthodox Christianity, in Western, both Protestant and Catholic tradition, you have a lot of different voices. So you cannot reduce either of these traditions to like a monolithic whole. Recently, colleagues from France published a whole book on this Catholic tradition in the early modern period itself as being just a combination of heterodox traditions. In the early modern period, you don't only have these Jesuits and the Dominicans, you also have then in France, for instance, the Jansenists, and the Jansenists in the 17th century, they also react against this legalistic way of thinking about Christian morality. So it's a very complex and interesting interaction, and I'm very actually curious to hear more about this contemporary Orthodox theological literature that kind of points down this specific feature that occurred in the Western legal tradition, but which in the Western legal tradition itself is not undebated. It's also controversial.
Well, thank you very much for your answer. I've written the article. I think it will be very helpful for my further research. As for some Orthodox sources, well, it's mostly something which has been written in the 20th century and even today. The most prominent author is a Greek theologian and philosopher. His name is Christos Yanaras. And he has written a few books, have been translated into English. It's, I think there is this book which is called Europe Has Been Born from a Schism, or I don't know, it's called in English Schism in Philosophy. It's called Schism in Philosophy. And there is this ground, I will write it in the chat, I will now find some additional titles, and he has a couple of chapters which are specifically directed to that causistic point of thinking. And he also made this whole idea that he's saying that orthodoxy is not a religion. Why? Because a religion is in its core causistic. You have a certain proposition, then you have a sanction, and so forth and so forth. It's like a table, and he always emphasizes the fact that it's a community of living people, and there are no rules. And they're saying that thinking is actually a remnant of that heuristic thinking, which got took over the Catholic Church, and which actually was taken by some Orthodox theologians in the 19th century, and now this whole movement is a neo-patristic movement, is like a revival of the old Orthodox thinking, and it's not been really often put in a way as a specific, I don't know, philosophy of law and in those manners, but often in those general theological manners, there is this objection that always keeps going, saying like, God is not an accountant, you know, he does not function that way. If he was an accountant, it wouldn't make any sense. And it's also present in those works of some of our own episcopes, but none of them have been translated in English. For example, Athanasius Jeftić, he also wrote about that, but I will write to you those works which have been translated in English, and I think it will be a good ground for you as well to familiarize yourself with the Orthodox standpoint on that question.
Yeah, thanks. That sounds very interesting. Perhaps on that issue of God as an accountant, yeah, so I have not gone into that, but of course these moral theologians, the Theologos Juristas of the School of Salamanca, they also dealt with, let's say, dogmatic theological issues regarding the relationship between God and man. And then, of course, in the early modern period, the big issue is the relationship between free will and grace, you know, gaining salvation, as you know. And there it's quite interesting to see that you have people like Francisco Suarez and Leonardus Lessius who are literally wondering and writing treatises about the question whether we can consider the relationship between God and man in terms of a contract, in terms of an employment contract, whereby God employs people in his garden to work, and whereby God has also a duty to pay the workers if they do their best, so if they are really living virtuously and so on. And so they at least raise the question, like, can we catch in this private law category of locatio conductio the relationship between God and man, and is this relationship then also being ruled by the rules of commutative justice and of also the need to respect your promise? So they apply this whole contract theory which they have developed in the private context to the relationship between God and man. And then, of course, I think Suarez goes really very far and really says, yeah, if you work hard as a believer, if you do works of charity, if you pray, if you also respect land and so on, then you know that you are accumulating merit in the eyes of God, and that God is under an obligation, like a legal obligation, to reward you in heaven. So that's the accountant perspective, you could say. But it's at the same time, let's say, from a purely, you know, independent of them beliefs, if you just look at it from a legal point of view, it's actually quite fascinating to see how contract law thinking, yeah, penetrates also their way of doing theology. Now, always they will, of course, at the end say that, of course, there is a mystery that goes beyond the contractual logic and goes beyond our human way of seeing this relationship between God and man. And even Lessius and Suarez, who go very far in this procedure, they will always at the end say that there is, of course, the grace of God, and that nobody can force God to bestow his grace upon the people. So they respect also the notion of grace, but it is true that especially in light of the Protestant threat of the 16th century, which put all the emphasis on the grace and also on patristic thought, and not on the legal aspects, they even emphasized more than it had already been the case in the Catholic tradition. Yeah, this potential contractual view also of the relationship between God and man. which is now also criticized in the Catholic tradition itself. But it is nevertheless interesting, I would say, from a legal perspective, from a legal historian's perspective, to see how they test their principles of contract law in thinking about the relationship between God and man. So thanks a lot for your comment. It was very useful to me, and I'm looking forward to the references which you will share with us. I think there are a couple of questions also on the chat. Nina?
Yes, Sophia sent them privately to me too, so I forwarded it. I'll just read it out loud in case someone's on the mobile phone, they can't see the chat very well. So she says, first of all, I would like to thank Professor Decock for an extremely interesting lecture. One of the things I find interesting is the discrepancy between the opinions of Max Weber and Thorstein Veblen, both German sociologists who lived at the same time. While Weber focused on working without spending and capitalism as a form of virtue, Veblen had quite an opposing view, with capitalist business leaders deliberately manipulating the market in order to gain as much profit as possible so they could use it as a symbol of social status through conspicuous consumption. I'm also interested in the relevance of Bible verses, Luke 14:14, and you will be blessed since they do not have the means to repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous, and Luke 6:34, if you lend to those from whom you expect to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners in order to receive back the same amount. Do these verses actually present an attempt by the religious doctrine to in some extent regulate contract law, or are they only moral norms?
Okay, yeah, once again, very interesting comments and questions. As to the first part, so this opposition between Max Weber and Thorstein Veblen, that's actually very interesting. I must say that I'm not aware actually of this, of all the details of Thorstein Veblen, but it's interesting. And of course, yeah, there is a lot of discrepancy there. And Max Weber acknowledged, especially after receiving all these critical reactions to his work, he acknowledged that there were many different ways of viewing the origins of capitalism. And yeah, perhaps it's in the face of Thorstein Veblen's notion of conspicuous consumption and the fact that capitalist business leaders tried to gain as much as possible, that he emphasized that his theory about the origins of capitalism had nothing to do with that very deep-seated desire of man to gain as much as possible and also show it to the world and so on. Yeah, so very interesting comment. Thank you for pointing out this theory, this concurring theory and opposing theory of Thorstein Veblen. If you have published anything on that, I would be interested to read it. And then, yeah, regarding the Bible, that's also a very pertinent remark. What you, of course, see all the time in those treatises is the reference to Luke 6:34, 6:35. Not so much to Luke 14:14, I have to say. This is not something that I've seen in the sources. But Luke 6:34, 6:35, mutuum date nihil indisperantes, so give loans without hoping for anything in return, is of course a key passage, and it poses a lot of headaches to the early modern scholastics because they somehow have to acknowledge that this is a rule of divine law, that interest is forbidden, and so they will always say, yeah, indeed, interest is forbidden. You cannot charge interest in loans. According to natural law and divine law, but then somehow they manage to find ways to go about these prohibitions. They developed in a very casuistical fashion the whole theory of extrinsic legal titles that can still allow someone then to charge interest. For instance, the whole idea that present money is worth more than absent money. This is the famous extrinsic title then of carentia pecuniae, kind of a liquidity preference, you could say. Well, that's a whole theory which allows them to go about that very famous verse of Luke, mutuum date nihil indisperantes. Interestingly, the Lutheran theologians at the time, in the 16th century, So after Luther, you have this whole Orthodox Lutheran tradition, which again, like tries to make use also of legal and moral, Catholic moral theological tradition to find Lutheran responses to cases of conscience. They will find another way to try to diminish the importance of Luke 6:34. They will just say, okay, the verse is important and it is right, but it only applies to loans which you give to poor people. So in a commercial context, this rule from Luke does not apply. So they make like, they say the scope of application of this verse in Luke is limited to, let's say, personal loans among friends or among relatives, or when you give loans to somebody who is really weak and a miserable person, to use a canon law category. But in a commercial context, this verse does not apply. But that's the way that those 16th century Protestant theologians can avoid the rigor of Luke 6:34. I would be interested to know what the Orthodox tradition also says in this regard, how they have interpreted the scope of Luke 6:34. So let's say that for the Protestants, they will say, use our modern categories, this is like a moral rule, which applies in your relationship with family and with friends and neighbors and so on, but not in a commercial context. The Catholics, they acknowledge that in divine law you have this prohibition, this general prohibition. They see it as a general prohibition on interest taking in loans, but then they find other ways, casuistic ways to legitimate and justify interest taking.
Thank you very much. If Sophia has anything to reply, she'll type it in the chat, and Mattia has sent you a few references in English on the subject that you've talked about. Does anyone else have any questions or comments? Alexis,
thank you.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you. First of all, thank you for your presentation, which was really interesting. I would like first to go back on the first question who was asked as the criticism about an excess of legalicism in the scholastic tradition also existed within the exact scholastic, as Thomas de Vio Cayetano considered that an excess of erudition and an excess of legalistic approach of the confession in the casuistic literature was not a good thing for confession, and he expressly said that it was creating negative moral as let's say a sin to prevent in order to not disobey God, wasn't the same as an ideal to pursue in order to accomplish God's will. So within the scholastic itself, criticism already existed at the same point and in the same time. Just wanted to say that. I've got a question which is quite precise. It's about Pedro de Oñate, which seems to me, with your quotes, like a very practical guy, a jurist. Why? Two questions actually, but they're both connecting. Why is it not so well known in Europe? And so, in fact, what was his impact in Southern America? I believe you said he came from Argentina, or he worked in Argentina. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your observations and questions, Alexis. Yeah, so you're right. I think to emphasize that really you have this pluralism of opinions within the early modern scholastic tradition. So indeed, Cajetan, we should not forget Tommaso de Vio Cayetanus, for instance, is someone who already was very active in writing biblical commentaries. So he wanted a return also to the Bible within the Catholic tradition itself, even before there was this Lutheran thread and so on. So he wrote a lot of very important commentaries on the Bible. So this is now also called biblical Thomism. We have a whole group of scholars working on that. At the same time, Cajetan is the one who introduced, while he was the general of the Dominican, he introduced, say, of Thomistic thought precisely because it was more able to respond to practical questions. And so he, of course, as you know, and also wrote a lot about money exchange and about sale contracts. So he was himself in the field of moral theology, very much thinking as a lawyer. But it's true, yeah, at the same time, he was also very much emphasizing the biblical tradition. And it's in general true, and that is, I think, sometimes the difficulty that we have when we read those ancient sources or early modern sources, that these were, to use the term by a German scholar, cultures of ambiguity. It's cultures of ambiguity. So it's not as dualistic and mutually exclusive as our current very rationalistic way of thinking. They could live with contradictions more, I think, than we can today. And in general, you have always this pluralism of opinions, which is also a sign of the importance of, let's say, of being learned at the time. Sometimes I have the feeling when I read those authors that I'm reading like decisions by the Supreme Court or by the European Court of Justice, where you have all these considerations and different points of view, and so it's very nuanced, and therefore, yeah, difficult to really summarize and say like this is the only opinion that they are hearing to. So it's very important always to, I think, as you say, to keep this in mind, that you have this diversity of opinions in this tradition. Yeah, and then as far as Pedro de Oñate is concerned, I'm afraid I would like to know much more about his life. There is very scant knowledge I have about it. My information comes from Italo Birocchi, an Italian scholar. He drew my attention to Pedro de Oñate. Actually, I do not know why he is so relatively unknown. I think it's to do with the fact that at the moment he writes his treatise in the mid-17th century, let's say that the early modern scholastic tradition in the European continent has reached its apex, and so afterwards it's no longer that important. You can see citations of Oñate later on, but far less than you find citations of Molina or of Soto or of Lessius. As far as the tradition then in South America is concerned, I'm not a specialist, but I would be eager to know whether specialists of early 19th century codification processes, for instance, in Chile and in other South American countries that become independent, have noticed any impact of Pedro de Oñate, because I know that there is Andres Bello, for instance, who was very familiar with the early modern scholastic tradition in general. So he cites Luis de Molina, for instance, but I do not know whether he cites Pedro de Oñate. So this is still very much, a mysterious figure as far as I'm concerned. Perhaps there are currently people working on him. So I have limited myself to reading his treatises on contract law. But as far as the historical context is concerned, and then also like his impact, I'm afraid more research is needed. I'm not sure it will be easy to find. But you can find his treatise online. There has been this digitization project by our colleagues from the Faculty of Law at the University of Milan. And they have, for instance, a fully scanned online versions of Pedro de Oñate, of the 4 volumes. So there you can read those volumes.
I will, thank you.
So there are clearly in many libraries in Europe, there are copies of Pedro de Oñate's De Contractibus. So the book was sold and has been acquired by a lot of colleges and universities. But it's true that, for instance, I have never found a reference to Oñate in Potier, for instance, or in other natural law thinkers who have done a very important impact on the codifications. Whereas someone like Robert Joseph Potier does cite Tomas Sanchez, he does cite Luis de Molina. So he does know that this tradition exists, but I've never found a reference to Pedro de Oñate.
Thank you for answer. It's okay for me.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? If not, since we're a little behind schedule as it is, Professor Poloyets, go ahead. Just turn your microphone on, please. Yes.
Just one short question, turning back to Roman law, because you mentioned many times Leonardo Slesius. I would like just to say that we in our law library have one copy of his book, De Justitia et Jure, and I was very impressed. Also, I was doing something on torts, but my question is whether he was also professor of Roman theology and Roman law, because I found somewhere such some information, because also it contradicts the idea that in the statute of the Society Jesu, it was prohibited to occupy a chair of law faculty at the same time as theology. So this is my question.
Well, that's a very interesting remark, and also interesting to know that Leonardo Slesius has even found his way into the law faculty library of Zagreb University. Small world. Yeah, Lessius was he was formally speaking from 1585 onwards. He was a professor in the Jesuit College of Louvain, and he was a professor of moral theology. And so he was not a professor, formally speaking, of either Roman law or canon law. He was just a professor of moral theology between 1585 and 1600. And after that, for health reasons, he was dispensed with teaching, and he could just write books and also continue to give practical exercises of casuistry to solve specific cases of conscience, and even have a book that gives us an overview of all these cases of conscience which he solved. So there are also many in succession law, for instance, not only in the field of commercial affairs. Yeah, so indeed, there was this incompatibility between being a professor of law and professor of moral theology. And so Lessius, even though he knew Roman law and canon law extremely well, was not a professor in those fields.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks for your comment.
If we don't have anyone else, I'm going to refrain. I might ask you a few things by email later, but let's not postpone the conference schedule too much. So let's thank Professor Decock once again for this wonderful lecture that obviously inspired a very interesting discussion. And we are going to take a short break now. Let's say we continue at 11:50 with our session for today. Professor Decock, of course, if you have time, feel free to stay and listen. If not, we say goodbye to you for the time being, and hopefully we'll meet in the near future sometime live.
It's been my pleasure. I really hope that we will be able to meet each other live. Because I learned of the conference on relatively short notice, I've had to insert my lecture into an already fully packed agenda, so I'm afraid I will not be able to stay for today. But let's keep in touch. So you have my email address, so also feel free to write me, and then we can continue the conversation. So I wish you all the best for the continuation of the conference, and hope to see you very soon in real life. Enjoy the break. Bye.
Thank you.